Welcome everyone to our Language Learners June resource wrap up, right? And we're going to guide you through how we've been studying our target languages over the last month. So, Lesedi, you excited for this wrap up?
Yeah, I'm super excited because for this episode, we're actually going to go even more specific. Last episode was more general, just a rough idea. But this episode, we're going like deep down into the nitty gritty, which is really cool.
Yeah, we want to go beyond just discussing content and recommending resources for you guys to use and discuss resources that are useful and techniques, more importantly, that are useful for very specific skills, right? How about we begin language by language? So, your big language right now is?
My main language I'm doing is Spanish. That's the one that
Ex-
covers most of my time. It's the main priority.
Cool. So, some rapid questions about what you've done in June. Top five resources that you've used. List them and tell us why they're in your top five.
Okay, so I'd say number one is strongly DeepSeek. So the reason why I say that's number one is because DeepSeek is like just tremendously good at explaining certain things. So I use that for past tenses instead of using YouTube videos like I normally do. But still, number two will still be YouTube because there's a lot of good YouTubers that explain quite well. The number one, the one that maybe people would like is Butterfly Spanish. She's just really amazing at teaching Spanish because she's like an actual teacher, and she has like a board, so it's like you're in a classroom. So that's number two, and then number three has to be Netflix. Like Netflix has so much content that's in Spanish. They allowing you to have the dub and subtitles. Fantastic. And then of course, I'm gonna add Disney because Disney also has a lot of content. I'm a Marvel fan, so I rewatch the Marvel movies in Spanish, which is amazing. So number four is gonna be Anki, of course, and then number five is gonna be the ChatGPT speaking option where you speak to the thing. So that's my top five. And that's because, of course, it's like a free way to practice speaking at any time, any day. It fits your schedule really nicely. But yeah, that's my five top resources.
You mentioned
How about
Anki, a resource that we didn't really discuss in our first wrap up. So for this June wrap up, anyone heading into July who wants to use Anki, could you explain to them what Anki is?
Oh, awesome, awesome. So Anki is basically a spaced repetition memory app. So it's not only for language learning. Some people have used it for their normal studies, like some students studying medicine, they use it as well. But basically, what it does is that it's almost like a way to improve your vocabulary. Like it's like a flashcard system. And the nice thing about it is that it reminds you of the word just as you're about to forget it. So let's say there's a word that you become super comfortable with, for example, alquilar, for example. So maybe the first few days you struggle to get it. So you get reminded of it like a couple times the first few days. But then after a week, it becomes super easy. Like you remember it the second you see it. But then eventually they stop showing it to you. And then in a month's time, you might forget that word and what it means. And then it pops up again in your Anki daily or weekly, however often you use it. And then it reminds you of that word just as you were about to forget it. It reminds you, and it's basically the concept of spaced repetition, which is one of the most effective ways to remember things. Basically, that's the best I can explain it. Like there's a scientist who can explain it in more depth, but yeah, Anki or Anki Droid, if you're searching it online, it's a really, really good app. And now to flip it to you, Gregory, what are your top five resources this week?
Yeah, I'm going to focus on Italian this time. So my top five resources on the language that I've really been focusing on, Italian. I've been reading a pretty complex novel. It's called I Promessi Sposi by Alessandro Manzoni, and it's typically translated as The Betrothed. And it's like a major landmark of Italian literature, and I'd actually like to make a video about it. But the Italian prose is pretty tricky. It's quite elevated. There's a lot of metaphor in there. If you're studying a language that you've left for a while, choose something that's going to challenge you somewhat. You want something that's going to elevate you and force you to get to a higher level. But this is actually resource one and two together because one of the casualties of the digital age is that we always have our phones on us. So why don't we use that to help us learn? And of course, many of you will know that on WhatsApp there's Llama. I think it's Llama 3. What I do is if I come across a word that's tricky, rather than like open up my laptop, load up ChatGPT, ask ChatGPT, what does this mean? Or look up on an online dictionary. I look at the phrase, look at the sentence, I try understand it 2 or 3 times. I'll read through it 2 or 3 times without consulting a translator. But if I still can't get it, I then just go to WhatsApp and I even just speak to him and I say, what does this word in Italian mean? And I'll ask the question either in Italian or in English, and I get a nice response quickly. Yeah.
Just to add on actually to what Gregory is saying, the lovely thing about reading is that normally novels and writing for any language generally uses significantly more vocabulary than most natives use in their everyday speech. So it actually allows you to get exposed to more vocabulary, get exposed to more grammar as well, because there's a lot of grammar that gets used in these books that sometimes people don't use in a TV show or in daily life. So it actually helps you learn even more and get you exposed to even more.
So that's resource one and two. Resource three would be Marco Capelli's Storia d'Italia. It's pretty
Mm,
complex, advanced level of Italian, and it really challenges me. And then also, I like to listen to Learn Italian with Lucrezia. She's got such a
yeah.
nice channel, and it's not Italian that's very difficult to grasp. So I like to use it as a way of kind of priming me for reading and listening to more complex Italian. So in between podcasts of something else, in between YouTube videos that I might be listening to while I'm driving or doing the dishes or washing or something, I'll
Mhm.
play a video from Lucrezia's channel. And then I think number five, it's also the ChatGPT speaking function. I'd like to speak Italian more. I should probably go on to Hello Talk, which is such a great networking app. But those would be my five resources currently, best resources for Italian. Before we move on to the next part of this video, I want to remind you all that if you also want to meet up to speak your foreign language, in this case, Spanish and Italian, we have a monthly Spanish cafe and also a regular Italian cafe. If you're not in the Johannesburg area, however, we also meet weekly to have hangouts speaking these languages. The best way to keep in touch about those and to keep up to date about those is to follow us on Instagram. You'll find the links in the description below, and I hope to see you soon at either of these events.
We've spoken about the resources, but I want to understand what are your top five techniques on how you use these resources to learn your languages. But we'll focus on your main language, which is Italian.
I mentioned a little bit of this beforehand, but I'd like to elaborate on it now. So, when I spoke about using Lama's knowledge of Italian to help me through I Promessi Sposi, I mentioned that what I'll try to do is read the text on my own first. And so this is something that's very important because our technology is so readily available to us. We've got so many translators out there. We often prevent ourselves from doing the work that we need to fully understand the text that we're reading. And
Mm-hmm.
by doing that, we're actually depriving ourselves of the opportunity to learn. So don't use these tools as a crutch. Really test yourself and use the tool only when you absolutely need it, right? So what I will often do with my reading is I'll read the whole page. And if I don't understand any of it at all, I'll still read through that whole page. Then
Mm-hmm.
afterwards, I'll think back, how much of that did I understand? And I'll try reconstruct everything in my mind and get an impression of what my impression was of what I read. And then what I do is I go back and I read it again more slowly, more deliberately. And almost invariably, after about the third read through of each paragraph, I've got more or less an idea of what's going on. And then if there's something that's not clear, I'm able finally to identify what those particular points are. Then I'm able to actually ask the questions.
Mm-hmm.
So that's probably technique one and two that works with those with both of the resources I've mentioned earlier. Um,
Yes.
the third most useful technique that I've found would also be with podcasts. So if you are someone who likes listening to YouTube or podcasts on Spotify or what have you, take advantage of the fact that we can actually slow down the audio. I listen to this particular podcast, Storia d'Italia, at zero point 0.9 speed. So it's almost 100% speed, but it's just low enough for me to start getting an idea of the narrative that Marco Capelli is constructing. And then maybe with the other one is, for want of a better term, I'm going to call it microdosing. I know that that's got like a specific clinical term in pharmacology now, but microdosing your language. So you don't have to go and sit down and binge through 3 hours of content in order to call that learning. Sometimes what's helpful is every time that you've finished like maybe a little chore or you finished an assignment or a particular allotted time for other work, take like 5 minutes to work through a podcast, listen to a segment of a YouTube video or something, just to keep that language like constantly part of your life. So that's another technique that I'd like to recommend. I do this with Learn Italian with Lucrezia. I listen to like one of her videos, and they're pretty short. They're like maybe maximum 10 minutes. And I'll listen to like one of them in between different things that I'm doing. And that helps me like really take advantage of the short period that I've given myself, a space of 8 days, to work on my Italian. And then I think the final technique that I'd like to recommend is I like to pay attention to the new words that I find that are really intriguing, really beautiful, or they sound funny or something. And I'll take that word and I'll write it down on a spare piece of paper and I'll try like write 10 sentences incorporating that word. And I find that 9 times out of 10, when I do that, I can then bring that word up in conversation in the future. So those are my 5 techniques. I'll round them up very quickly. They are when reading and using translators, work through it yourself as much as you can first, and then only rely on the translator. So specify exactly what it is, what word, down to the word that you're struggling with, and then use the translator for that. The next one would be take advantage of slowing down audio on audio files that you have access to. Then the other two would be spend time to inject a little bit of your target language throughout your routine. And finally, pay attention to words and things that are salient to you that you find funny or beautiful or interesting or even sometimes a bit repellent. Try incorporate them very deliberately in a few sentences that you write down. That's how I've been really trying to accelerate recapturing my Italian fluency. But for you, for your Spanish, if there are 5 techniques that you found yourself relying upon regularly over the last month, what would you say they are?
Okay, these techniques are gonna like bleed into each other a lot because that's kind of the way I like to learn the language. What I would say actually is that Anki it's actually useless if I'm using it on its own, right? Because most of the words that I see in Anki, a lot of the time they're not in context. But what actually helps them stick a lot better is the other stuff that I do as well. So especially the watching. When I'm still in the early stages, I watch the Spanish audio with English subtitles so that I can still understand it, so I can still enjoy the content. Because if I'm confused, I'm not going to enjoy the content. I'm not going to look forward to watching it. And I'm not going to be consistent and disciplined in watching it, right? One of the best examples I'll use is the word peor, right? So the first time I saw it on Anki, it was so weird. So for those who don't know, peor is worse in Spanish. So the first time I read it, like, because there's no audio for the Anki deck I have, so I saw it and I didn't even know how I would pronounce that, and it seemed weird. I was like, okay, peor, it's worse. It means worse, and I'm like, I swear I've never seen this ever. Like at the time in my head, I was like, I've never seen this word. Like I've never seen it written. I've never heard it, and I was like, what an odd word. But then that day when I was watching an episode of Snakes and Ladders, that same day when I watched that episode, all of a sudden I heard the guy say peor. And then I was like, wait a minute. And then I rewind. So this is another technique which you can use. If you're listening in English and then sometimes you notice some words in Spanish or you think you know what they're saying in Spanish, then you rewind and then you put the Spanish subtitles to see how it looks when it's written in Spanish. So I would do that. And then I saw, oh, wait a minute, peor. Like I just saw that word and then I couldn't stop noticing it. Like I noticed it throughout the entire day. Like the rest of that episode, I noticed it like 4 or 5 other times. But before that, someone would say peor, but it would literally fly over my head. I wouldn't have even noticed it. But because I'm using Anki and I'm combining those two, it like I would notice the word a lot more. And then also when I'm speaking now, because that word, for example, peor, has now ingrained into my mind. Now when I speak, I can speak to the ChatGPT and say, "Oh my gosh, today's day was peor than yesterday." That's kind of how it gets cemented into my mind by combining all these resources at the same time. And then one other thing as well, sometimes when I'm watching an English show, actually, I will think of what the person said and I'll try and say the whole sentence in Spanish in my head. And then I check on ChatGPT what that English sentence is in Spanish. And then I see how right I am. So sometimes I'm like, sometimes I'm way off and I'm like, oh my goodness, okay, okay. And then I kind of work on it. And then sometimes I'm like 80% right. And I'm like, oh, okay, so there's this little thing that I need to improve on. And then I'm saying the sentence correctly.
Cool. Yeah, I think that's a brilliant one. So we're going to finish off with maybe one or two last questions. Of June, what was your biggest frustration in language learning?
I think it would be the past tense aspect of Spanish because I feel like it's a lot. That's what I would say. It's a lot because I actually found out that a lot of the tenses that are used, that English is actually kind of light on tenses, actually. Like, it is actually comparatively lighter. It has way fewer past tenses. So just learning multiple past tenses because they're all important in their own way and used in different contexts, that's a bit annoying.
And how did
And
you address
yourself?
that frustration?
That was the day where I was like, okay, you know what? If I do this for 30 minutes, like my normal allotted time that I set for specific study, I won't finish past tense. I'll take forever. So I decided that day to go over all of them and to go over the irregulars as well and really kind of like dive deep into it. I think that's what I would say in terms of my frustration and how I solved it. And on your side, what would you say your frustration was in Italian?
Probably my biggest frustration this month was not reaching that level of fluency that I wanted to. And maybe I should qualify that. When I talk about fluency, I'm not talking about like constant cognitive comfort with the language, for want of a better word. What I mean more is the fluidity. I find always when I try and learn a language or when I try brush up on a language, there's a period, as I mentioned, it happens for me to equate to about 8 days when I get started with the language and then about 5 days in, if I am quite consistent and conscious about working on the language, I get to a point where I'm producing the language very naturally and easily.
Mhm,
And then at about day 8, I kind of like taper off there, and then my capacity plateaus. And then that's sign for me, okay, let me take a break now and work on something else. I
mhm,
never really reached that to the degree I wanted to in July. So my goal next week is going to be a little bit less strict with myself. Rather than say I'm just going to work on this language for 8 days and leave it, regardless of my comfort and how I've been able to work on the language. I'm going to rather work on that language very consciously up until the point that I experience that like boost in comfort and fluidity, and then experience the plateau where I can see, okay, the words are just not coming as naturally as they once did. And maybe it's a recommendation to everyone else. Set up a schedule, but always set up a schedule knowing that a schedule is always provisional. There's going to be a time
mhm,
when you realize this particular technique, this way of approaching the language is really working for me, then go ahead with that for as long as it does. Everyone's mind is ultimately different, and we all process information and we all learn languages in a slightly different style. And so we have to account for that. Tools are never what make you learn the language, how you use the tools are. And that's actually a lot of what today's wrap up has been about, both the resources, the tools that we can recommend, but also the techniques we've been using to approach those tools. So, my recommendation to anyone watching is if you have any questions that you'd like to see answered in our next wrap up, that will be the July wrap up, leave them in the comments below. We always read those and answer them. You guys know that. And keep an eye out for our events. You know that we are on Instagram. That's the best place to keep updated with our Spanish cafe, our Italian cafe, and all the other social events that we organize. So, we will say goodbye to you guys now and see you in the next video. Ciao.
ciao.